Shana, the Yasser, the Hay, Rav Heppel, and also this is a very famous specific and very happy Nishba, the Horror for Yamir, Casper, and also Nash, and Shek, and Amak, the Waka, Isa, Eva, Boyimoit, the oil of Lichtam, David, Shomeni, El, Sisi, Koch, Omar, Illinois, and the Boss of Allah, the Creation, Mashiach, all the same, and Atiri, Katzibon, Yirbu, as well as a Macher, Mohor, Balas, and the Skirzen, Dom, Balas, and I said, Mosfosa, and then Spoki, the Koisi, after Tomer, Kairov, Chavol, Maflu, Libas, Emin, and Napolis, Rafa, Borges, Illinois, Asher Yatzani, and Lelos, Yusuri, Yosef, Shivisi, and Happy Summit, Kimi, Mini, Sama, Livi, Yolo, Kiloidi, after Soyish, going all that of Kilois, as a Kashi, Moisit, Hasid, Khadir, Shachas, Yedi, Ira Chaim, Soeva, Small, as Ponecha, Imais, Mincha, Nasa.
Father, the Moravasa Shlita, has known Levitin for many, many decades. I'd like to share with us his memories.
We've gathered here today to give last honor and respect to find an upright woman, dearly beloved by her family, cherished and esteemed by all who were privileged to know her. Sara Kaplan, Leah Hashum. With this pain and sadness that I learned yesterday of her demise, she reached, Baruch Hashem, the ripe old age of 98 years. The last years of her life, unfortunately, were not so good, but she was surrounded by a loving family who cared for her and looked after her with devotion. Didn't take so much of a participation anymore in public life. But for children to know that their mother is still there, that there is a warm heart beating with abundant love and overflowing concern for them, gives you such strength. So that even if, as v'sholem, they're not able to participate fully, by us life is so precious, every minute of it, it's one of the prime, significant elements that the loss is very great. A personal connection with the Kaplan family goes back to the day that we arrived here in Canada. The family, my father had come earlier, became Rov of Talmud Torah, Eitz Chaim, Teres Emes, and it happened to coincide with the bris of the firstborn son of Yitzchak, so I was angesinnt. Mesaide was still alive at the time. He said, "You came to me, to the Yoel Novi." And I remember there at the time, I have Moshe Kaplan, Zichrono Livrocha. My father was Rovin, the shul. He became Rosh Yeshiva, Yeshiva's Marie Grovat, named after the mise of the great scholar. He at that time engaged in a Dvar Halacha, or Masechta Nidin, the Sugya of Mokal Mikoymai Tomei, mentioned 4 times and he connected them. And I remember that afterwards my father and he engaged in a heated discussion about that. And of course he was instructing generations of Talmidim in Eitz Chaim, first in Grobert and then in Eitz Chaim, introducing him to the sweetness of Torah study. And he had with him his life companion and partner. I know that when the Mir Yeshiva came to Shanghai, I was informed that they found Some members of the Jewish community were there at the harbor to welcome them. And es gewesen dort ein Ayid with a long flowing beard, a Chussid Chabadi, Reb Chaim Plotkin, Zechayne Lebrocha. Later made it together with the whole family here to Toronto. I remember such a warm-hearted individual. And you had a combination of at one time an outstanding Baal Torah and a warm Hasidic Yid, and these were sort of the pillars of the home that they managed to build here in our Toronto Jewish community. Into the tradition of Sor Imenu, the house was built with a special broche. Broche in the Isa, in the Doe, house of hospitality, where people always were welcomed. Ner Doluk, Ner Shabbos, Ner Shabbos. The Shabbos lights cast their spiritual shadow throughout the week. Onum Kosher Alu Oyel. The Shechina was always present with Torah, with the warmth of Hasidus, in harmonious combination. And this is how they were examples, models for their children, their family. These were the values that were transmitted. I just mentioned to Gershon, I remember his father sitting in Etz Chaim downtown, in the shul, chazering with him, Mishnayis, Mesech de Bruches, Baal Peh, learned with the children, gave over to them, Avas, Torah, and Mitzvahs. Remember the time when the majority of the Mirna, Junge Leid, came to Toronto. Many of them had settled in New York, but there's a regulation that become a landed immigrant, they had to have a visa, and the visa had to be obtained out of town. And so they would come here, take their visa, and then return. It was one time, Sara Kaplan apparently had to miss the Shia, he had some obligation. And one of the Bochum substituted for him. Afterwards he asked in the class, was it the same type of approach in learning? You know, the beautiful Hespedim of what the Gemara means. And he said, of course it was. This was the privilege that we have, to have them with us all this time. And the home, of course, that was the domain of the mother of the house. As I said, the broches of Sor Imenu. Chazal tell us that there's something special about Sora. She was the only woman to whom Hashem spoke directly. Well, the Nevi'as, but the message was conveyed through a Malach. And her Ruach HaKodesh was even greater than that of Avraham. Creating the balance. That to know how to train children, how to raise them, on the one hand. This was the way that they operated in harmony, giving of their kindness, of the love of Torah and mitzvahs, and the Benodim Lachveiroi, teaching them how to grow, and transmitted also to the numerous Talmidim who were privileged to learn at the Rosh feet. An interesting thought of the Vilna Gaon. We find in the Torah that the Torah enumerates Chaye Odom, calling me Odom Asher Chai. Similar expression you find also by Avraham Avinu, lived 175 years, Asher Chai. And everybody wants to know what is the meaning of Asher Chai. You know, Medrash tells us that Odom Rishon gave 70 years of his life that David HaMelech should have them, and he lived to be 70. Similarly, Avram Avinu was deprived of 5 years of his life, that you shouldn't see how one of his children, Esav, went off the derech. It shouldn't spoil his old age that you would say, Avram Zucker Bayomin Vashem Deus Avram Bakai. Says the Lutz Karov. So too you find an expression, Shlei Chayis. What is life really? Life is when you can act, when you can achieve, when you can accomplish, when you can do good, when you, in a way, deserve the benefits that Hashem has given to you. It's not Namu de Kisufo. But if one is deprived, life itself is a supreme value. And this is the gift that the family had in the presence of their mother until old age. Always there, was thinking of them and being a source of inspiration to them. The Medrash says in connection with sorrow, V'deya Hashem yimei tmimim v'nachlosim le'olam tira. Hashem knows those who are perfect in their lives, who consistently live up to their obligations, both in Hashemayim and also in Odom Lachveiroi. Nachlosim le'olam tira, they leave an everlasting legacy, a heritage which the children of Hashem are so proud to follow. Those who cared and looked after her, even during her troubled years. I understand that especially the Havers took her in. Those who were here, the others came in to see, to give her support and to know that she was not alone. Beide should be Bila Movis Netzach and Mochu Hashem Elikim Dima Me Al Kol Konim.
On behalf of the family, Chaim Kaplan would like to share with us the Hespedim.
Eulogize a mother, a grandmother, great-grandmother, the matriarch of our family. Words come stiltedly, and we feel inadequate to the task. Avraham displayed the sorrow of Kaisa. Avraham Avinu came to eulogize Sarah Imenu and to cry for her. Chazal tell us that the order should be Bechi, crying first, and only then eulogy, Hespedim. The natural inclination of a relative or a close confidant is first to cry, and then, when the crying abates, to arouse oneself to further remembrance of the departed. Yet Avraham Avinu did exactly the opposite. First came Hespedim, and then Bechi. I saw a beautiful explanation offered in the Sefer Be'er Yosef. The order of Bechi first and then Hespedim, as stated by Chazal, suffices for close family members whose natural inclination is Bechia, is crying. However, for a person who achieved lofty levels in life, whose life was complete and replete with overcoming obstacles and remaining faithful to Hashem Yisborach, the loss is for the world at large, that no longer has the spiritual impact of this individual. For such a person, a Bechia must be prefaced by Hespedim, so that the world should know what is lost, and only from there come to Bechia, crying, from an acknowledgement that the world is a lesser place without the spiritual impact of the individual. Sarah Imenu was such a person, as the Rav said, Shnei Chai Yisor Kulin Shavim L'Teva. All the years were complete. She lived up to her potential every moment of her day, every year of her life, with acts of kindness and goodness. We too can be said to be in the position of Vayava Lispa the Sara Kaisa. While for us as immediate family, crying comes naturally, our loss is potent and our loss is very palpable. We need to make mention of Rabbi Alei Shalom's lasting impact on us and on the community at large in order to fully appreciate the magnitude of our loss. We thank Hashem Yisborach for Rabbi's long and healthy life, a life that was complete with kindness and goodness that traversed continents and bridged generations. Rabbi's life was also complete with many trials and tribulations, each one of which would seem to an observer to be an insurmountable test that would have the potential to break down a person emotionally, physically, and spiritually. My grandmother, Alei Shalom's long life, she suffered religious and physical persecution in her birthplace in Siberia at the hands of the communist Yimach Shimon. She came of age in a lovely home, but in a refugee city in China that at the time was devoid of Jewish infrastructure and among refugees who lived in abject poverty and dire conditions. She lost one child at birth and another during her lifetime. She lost a husband at a relatively young age and another husband later on in life. And in spite of her many personal troubles, she remained strong and happy, positive in her outlook, and always looking to do good for others. I have often remarked that she was the strongest person that I have known. Her force of being and her fortitude of character shone through with every encounter. Rabbi Alei Shalom always reflected a certain refinement and nobility of character, so befitting her upbringing and her stature in life. I said before that the community was very impacted by my grandmother Alei Shalom. Let me explain. The pasuk says, "Eitz chaim hi l'machazikim bo, v'semcha l'mushar." The Torah is a tree of life to those who grasp and cling to it, and its supporters are praiseworthy. The Vilna Gaon explains that the first clause of this pasuk refers to grabbing the Torah with two hands, the left and the right hand, symbolic of the two types of mitzvahs, mitzvahs eseh and mitzvahs loisa aseh. How will we love to do mitzvahs, positive, and refrain from doing negative mitzvahs? In her presence, you felt Yiras Shamayim, you felt an enjoyment of all the mitzvahs that we would do together with her. The second part of the pasuk, v'semcheo ushar, v'semcheo is plural. It refers to the two toimchen, the two supporters of Torah. Those who support physically the work of Talmidei Chachamim, taking care of them physically, and those who provide monetary and lay leadership assistance to Torah and to Torah institutions. Not many people have the zechus to embody both types of tomchen, of supporters. Chazal teach us, Eishes chaver techaver, the life of a Talmid Chacham is equivalent to the Talmid Chacham himself. It is only through her selfless devotion and care that a Talmid Chacham is able to pursue excellence in Torah learning. Were it not for her, the Talmid Chacham would be unable to achieve. Truly, Shali Shalach, that which is belonging to the Talmid Chacham is 100% the portion of his life. My Zayda Zikrat Tzaddik Levracha was a first-rate Talmid Chacham, a student of the great Rosh Yeshiva pre-war Europe, and a person of exceedingly refined character. He educated hundreds of Talmidim in his 30-plus years of teaching Torah in Toronto, in an era before the influx of Torah Yiddishkeit that we experience today in our city. This served as setting the table and crafting fertile ground for what was to follow. It was not easy to disseminate Torah to a post-war generation that was at times far removed from the generation in which my grandfather Zikrat Tzaddik Levracha was raised. And at all times, my grandmother Alei Shalom stood by his side, supporting his endeavors and raising a beautiful family that is true to Torah and its values. My earliest memories are of my Zayda Zikrat Tzaddik Levracha writing Kedusha Torah at the dining table, and my grandmother ensuring that the environment was peaceful and calm so he could prepare his Kedushin. In his later years, he was ill, and he needed special foods. And I remember very clearly my grandmother working very hard to prepare those foods for him so that he can continue in health teaching Torah. Further, my grandfather Zikrat Tzaddik Levracha was a person of extremely refined character, a tzenua, a person who always forgave his own honor for other people. These were qualities that we saw constantly in my grandmother. What was his was hers, and what was hers was his. Later in life, my grandmother married a second time to Rav Tzvi Karol Mitzvah Levracha, Zechron Levracha. Uncle Harry, as he was known affectionately in the family. Uncle Harry Zikrat Levracha was an embodiment of the second type of Timchel HaMelushar. In his many years of public life, Uncle Harry followed the way of his great father, Rabbi Meyer, ensuring that Torah education was a primary focus of the nascent community, and selflessly supporting the Talmud Torah and Shul, both with his gentle style of lay leadership and monetarily. My grandmother again rose to the responsibility and ensured that Uncle Harry had everything that he needed to continue his holy work. What was his was hers, and what was hers was his. Eitz Chaim Yilma Chazikim Ba, B'Simcha Emusha. V'Yaleh Hashem was such a positive force. When we sit with her, she exuded content and happiness. Our visits were always full of laughter and song. Another person's simcha was her happiness, and in spite of not being socially active in her later years, she always rejoiced when hearing shtat news. She especially lit up when we would sing zmiras. Meinam Hapa, Harubanoam were her favorites. She just didn't listen to the zmiras. She would sing along forcefully, echoing the tunes that she learned at her father's table. She was very proud of all her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. Oh, how she wanted to attend Moshe's upcoming bar mitzvah. And she always was so thankful to all those who made time to visit her in her later years. Remember your kind and loving Bobi and the lessons of her life. Be content with your portion in life and be strong in your lunas Hashem. Bobi was Nefteris on Zois Chanukah, the last day of Chanukah. Zois Chanukah, the ending of your life, is the culmination of a Chanukah Samizbeach, a devotion to her family, Chinuch, and Torah. We can point be'etzba, as Chazal tell us when you say the word Zois, you point be'etzba, and you say Zois Chanukah. Your life was a life of purpose, and through it, you rededicated a mishpach and a community. I want to end by thanking the caregivers, the doctors over the last 2 years of her life for their kindness and support. By thanking my father, my uncle, and my aunts for their continuous support to Bobi, both toward the end and in the hard years following Mazdeda's and Katzara Kabrachos Betira. I want to ask Mechila if I was ever unkind or uncaring. May her memory be of our blessing, and may she be a blessed associate for the family, the community, and Klal Yisrael. Teinam Shetzur B'Tzorach Chaim.
After the Einichot and the entire family, it's the Hebrew Sweet will deliver the Jehess.
At the end of the Yontif of Sukkot, after spending the entire holiday with Hashem, he says to us, Kosher alai predaschem. Just stay another day. Perhaps this is the answer to the age-old question, why is Hanukkah 8 days and not 7 days? If the miracle of Hanukkah, the oil, lasted for an extra 7 days. Perhaps the 8th day of Hanukkah is like the 8th day of Sukkot. The Rabban Shalom tells us, Kosha alai predaschem, stay another day. And that is the day of Bobi's Pedira. Zois Hanukkah, Kosha alai predaschem. We are forever grateful to Hashem for the schus of Bobi's 98 years. For many years, my father Shlita would visit with Bobi, make a coffee, and say to her, L'chaim. And she would respond, L'chaim u'levracha. And in the end, she lived to 98, which is the gematria of L'chaim. But notwithstanding her arichus yamim, we wish that we could have just had a little bit more time with you, Bobi. The only words that come to mind are Kasha alai predaschem. Mommy, Auntie Esti, Uncle Gershon, and Uncle Avram. You have lost your mother, and we, the grandchildren, we have lost our grandmother, and our children have lost their great-grandmother. All of us here today have lost yet another link in the chain of our beloved nation of Klal Yisrael, and we are impoverished. As was mentioned, Bobi was born in Irkutsk in Siberia in 1920, Tafresh Pei. Her parents were Reb Chaim and Braina Plotkin, Chabad Hasidim of the Heilige Rebbe, the Rayatz of Lubavitch. Reb Chaim Plotkin was a sheikhet and a moyel in Siberia, and he was known to the Russians of the town as the rabbi. Bobi's youngest years were spent in a time where communism was the way of life in Russia, and religious persecution was becoming a threat to their very existence. The Plotkin home was one of Mesiras Nefesh Mamish. Bubby told me the following story many, many times. One day in the Plotkin home, in walked a Russian officer and pointed a gun directly at Reb Chaim Plotkin. Bubby was less than 10 years old at the time and was standing right there in full vision of the incident. And the officer said in a loud voice, "Rabbi, when will you stop practicing the religion of yours? And when will you give up your God for once and for all?" Without hesitating, Reb Chaim, Tzedek Chaim, shouted back, "I chose my religion and my God long ago, and I don't plan on changing anything now." He then ripped open his shirt and said, "If you want to kill me, do it right now." At that point, the officer was shocked at the Jew's reaction. He put down his gun, turned around, and he walked away. It was then that Reb Chaim told his family it was time to escape. Oy Bubby, Kasha Alai Pradasa. In and around 1930, the Plotkins, together with Bubby, her 3 older sisters, an older brother and younger brother, attempted to escape to Shanghai, China. The oldest brother of Rom did not make it. He was imprisoned and sent to Siberia, and they never really were able to find out what had happened to him. The rest of the family settled in Shanghai, where Bubby was raised, and where Rabbi Plotkin served as a sheikhet in the Moil under the Chabad Rav Ashkenazi. Bubby often told us that Shanghai, although it is a city most well known in our circles for housing a yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva during the war years, but in the early 30s, it was far from a yeshivish community. In fact, it was a modern, even a secular community, to the point that many of the boys and girls who grew up there did not remain frum. Being the youngest in the family, she did not become of marriageable age until the Mir Yeshiva arrived in the early 40s. And instead of marrying someone her own age, who grew up together with her in Shanghai, she chose to marry a Talmid Chacham, Zayda, who was an altar mirror and an altar bacher at that point, 10 years her senior. Zayda was already known in the Litvish world, yeshiva world, as a goyin and a star. He was a Talmid of Reb Shimon Shkop of Grodno and Reb Yerucham Levovitz of the Mir. At age 30, before the wedding, he had mastered all of Shas with Tosfos. Zayda knew every Tosfos in Shas. Bubby once told me that many years later she saw him one day very upset about something. He was disturbed. She asked him, "What's bothering you?" And he responded that he had forgotten the location of a single Tosfos. There is not a picture of Zayda that I'm aware of, aside from at a Simcha, that he is not in front of his Gemara. This was the life that Bubby chose. She knew very well at the time, when marrying a Talmid Chacham was the least popular thing to do, that she was in for financial struggle, and that Parnassa would be difficult. Yet that is what she wanted. Those were her struggles, and they materialized just as she had feared. Yet she embraced the life of Mesiras Nefesh, simply because that was the home that she had been raised in, and that was who she had become. Oy Bubby, Kasha Alai Pradasta. In the early 1940s, Zayda was identified by a well-known Yid in Toronto. His name is no secret, Reb Itchemeyer Korolnik Zecher Tzadik Levracha, who asked Zayda to fill the position of Rosh Yeshivas Maril Grubert, the position that had once belonged to Rav Yankov Kamenetsky Zecher Tzadik Levracha. The yeshiva lasted for 7 years and ultimately merged with Eitz Chaim. Zayda became the 9th grade Rebbe, a position that he would hold until his retirement in the late 70s. Those years were not easy for the two of them. They worked very hard. They had good friends in the community. They were adored in the community and in the shul by the Balabatim and the generations of Torontonians who had become their Talmidim. Bubby told me that Zayda several times had been offered to take up bigger and better positions in more famous yeshivas in the United States. But he turned them down because he was sure that Toronto would be the best place to raise his children. The Gemara in Tainus says, Daf Chaf Amud Beis, Shalu Talmidav l'Rav Ada bar Ava b'ma ha'arachta yomim, Omer lehem miyamai lo hikbadeti b'toich beisi. Our Bubi was a real woman. She never lost herself. Even when she got nervous because a child was doing something dangerous, she never lost herself. She always remained calm. She was the easiest person to talk to. We would play Ramaku with her. We would eat Rajankis mit Manglan. As the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, she would make us feel special and important. We loved visiting Bubi. The stories that Bubi told made a lasting impression on all of us. There was literally a fire in her eyes when she told us stories about Zeta's friends, that Rabbi Ox mentioned, who stayed with them when they visited Toronto. Who were Zeta's friends? Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, Reb Leib Malin, Reb Nachum Pertzovitz, Reb Chaim Visoker, and other Alter Mirs, Zechronam Livrocha. She told us that they used to argue with each other. Literally, they used to scream at each other the holy words of Torah until the wee hours of the morning. Her eyes were alive when she told us those stories. That fire penetrated our hearts, our essence. We asked ourselves, how could we ever be like them? How could we be passionate for Torah? How could we do in our lives? What could we do in our lives that would reach that level? These were questions that we asked ourselves then. And these are questions that we continue to ask ourselves now. Not only because our Zeta was a goyin and a tzaddik, that we were not old enough to be zeichet to see as he passed away in the early 80s. But it was the fire in Bubi's eyes that became the fire of Torah in our hearts and the fire of our Messiah. And we were zeichet to this constantly for our share of her 98 years. There was no greater gift that Hashem could have bestowed upon our family than Bubi. She was an Eishes Chayil who was moiser nefesh for Torah and for Yiddishkeit. She was from the old world, yet she was from the new world at the same time. She had the ability to transmit the Messiah in her very simple way. But Bubi did not have an easy life, as Chaim mentioned. She was widowed at a young age of 60. And then tragedy struck again as she lost her eldest daughter, the unforgettable Auntie Ada Gordon from Harnof, almost 20 years ago. There are two people that must be mentioned who filled those gaps of Bubi's sadness, the Simcha Sachayim, and kept her going. Ironically, as the Rav and Chaim mentioned, Bubi was lucky enough to marry Uncle Harry Karolnik, Allah v'Shalom, father of Moish and Joy, who themselves naturally became brother and sister to our parents and our uncles and aunts. Uncle Harry was the son of Rabbi Meyer Karolnik, Zeichet Tzadik Livrocha, who had originally brought Bubi to Toronto. Uncle Harry was a gentleman, the kindest, sweetest man you've ever met, and he treated Bubi like a queen. We are forever grateful to him, may his neshama have an aliyah, and to you, Joy and Moish, for the way that you treated Bubi like a mother. It must be noted that Uncle Harry was nifter 18 years ago to this day on the secular calendar. The other person who filled Bubi's life with Simchas Chaim on a daily basis, and must be specifically mentioned with the permission of all of my uncles and aunts, is our mother, Zolzain Gesund. Mommy took care of Bubi's every need on a daily basis during the many decades that Bubi lived alone. Our mother does not want me to elaborate, so I will say that she is a living model of Kivat Avayim, the lights of which are simply not normal in our door. Most people are not zoichet to be able to see parents take care of their own parents for as long as we have in the Kaplan and the Haber families. We can only thank Hashem over and over again for allowing us the schus of having parents who are role models in the mitzvah of Kibbut Avayim. Mommy, your entire life, and especially throughout the last few years, you dedicated to the care of your mother. Hashem knows it wasn't easy for you. Your kindness and your care for Bubi will always be remembered by us and our children. You are an example for all of us, and you are an example for the entire community. I would also, as Chaya mentioned, like to make special mention of Bubi's caregivers, Angel and Madeline, and all the other PSWs. You treated her like a regal queen that she was, even though it wasn't always apparent. We are forever grateful. Bubi, on behalf of the entire family, I would like to ask Mechila from you. We didn't treat you properly. We didn't give you the cover that you deserved. We didn't visit you enough. And even when we did, it wasn't enough. We took, and we took, and we took, but we forgot to give. And so is the way of the world. Midor ledor. Bubi, may you be a Melitz Yersher for the extended Gordon families of Eretz Yisrael, for the extended Kaplan families of Los Angeles, Toronto, and New York, and for the Haber and the Stern families. Bila hamavis lanetzach, u'malcha Hashem Elokim dima me'al kapanim, tihi nishmasu tzrura b'tzvara chayim. Amen.
Sara, Chaim, and Reina, who we affectionately also knew later in life as Sonia Koronik, the wife of a great Talmid Chacham, and later the wife of a great, dear community leader, Harry Koronik. In her regal manner, radiated nobility. The Torah tells us, Vayigash Elov Yehuda, Yedaber na Avdecha, V'oznei Adoini Dover, Val Yichar Apcha Ve'avdecha. Yehuda requests permission to step up and come close to the Viceroy of Egypt and speak to him personally from the heart. And the obvious question is that at this point in time, Yehuda was not aware that Yosef, the Viceroy, spoke Lashon HaKodesh. How could he communicate if there is a language barrier? How can he speak personally up close without a translator to the Viceroy of Egypt? It's well known in the late 70s, under the dictatorship of Ceausescu in Romania, a group of 20 Jews, it was decreed that they would be sent to the Gulag, to labor camps, to forced labor camps. The Skulener Rebbe, who had escaped to the United States of America, became aware of their plight. He began to cry. He called a Rav in Seattle, who was connected to Senator Scoop Jackson, and he asked him to arrange a meeting. The rabbi told him, he is leaving Washington. I don't know if that's possible. And the Rebbe told him, when 20 Jewish lives are at stake, nothing is impossible. And he tracked down the senator, and he agreed to meet him that morning. They flew to Washington, and the Rebbe uncharacteristically stepped into the senator's office, and he said to him, I haven't davened Shabbos yet. Can you please allow me to pray before we meet? And the senator uncharacteristically looked at the Rebbe's angelic face, and he stepped aside, and the Rebbe engaged in Tfilas Shacharis. After davening, without waiting for the rabbi from Washington to ask to operate as interpreter, the Rebbe turned to the senator, and he began to cry, 20 Jiden, There's 20 Jews whose lives are in danger. And the rabbi from Washington began to translate. And the senator turned to him and he told him, step aside. You don't need to translate. The language of the heart speaks for itself. The language that Yehuda spoke to Yosef. The language that we saw in Sonia Kaplan. By her very being, her essence of nobility. She radiated the values of Torah. Her self-sacrifice to marry a Talmid Chacham, pushing him to become who he became. And we saw in later years how she did the same for Harry, who used to come to shul all the time to sit and learn. Pushing her family and her children to imbibe those values. And we hope that this beautiful mishpacha, generations of Erliche people, generations of Talmidei Chachamim, are the greatest tribute to her memory. We hope to continue to follow in her footsteps and merit the idyllic moment when death itself is vanquished. Of Umacha Hashem Dimo E'al Kopanim V'Noimar Amen. Ask everyone to rise as Chaim Kaplan will say the Kelvin. Section of Bathurst Lawn Cemetery. Shiva will be at 10 Prue Avenue, apartment number 102C2. Shachris will be at 7:15 a.m. and Mincha and Meir will be at 4:35 p.m. Please allow for the Avelim to exit.